I'm going to jump right in with something along that topic. You're a lawyer by trade.
I am.
When you came in 2 years ago running for executive council, you said you were going to be curtailing some of your work so as not to provide conflict or appearance of a conflict. So what have you, how has that gone? What have you backed off of, or what are you doing now professionally?
So I reduced the hours in my practice, so I'm down to not quite half-time in my practice. I don't appear before any state agency. Obviously, I don't sue the state anymore.
Is that a big loss in income?
It's not a loss in income, but it means I have to try and affect policy in a different way.
Yeah, okay.
I've not run into any particular problems in staying to my promises. I also resigned my partnership in the law firm so that I don't profit from the work of others who still do appear in front of agencies, and I'm screened from those cases. And I think the last time I was here, I'd already stopped being general counsel, so to my law firm. So I've continued to avoid that.
And what surprised you most about the job of being the executive council?
To be honest, what surprised me most was the lack of guidelines. The job of executive counselor is pretty much what you make of it. And if you have broad interests and you're intellectually curious, there's almost no limit to what you can do. That's been a great deal of fun for me, quite frankly. There's some effort to limit that by others who don't approach the job so broadly, or in instances where your interest actually allows you to dig up information that others don't want publicly revealed, and the pushback on that has been a little bit of a surprise. But I've really enjoyed doing this, and I hope to do it again.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You've been a particularly active member of the council. Some might even say activist. What with calling out contracted firms over pay scales and investigating complaints personally regarding liquor sales. Moving forward as a counselor, where would you see that leading? What do you think that would encourage other members of the council to do similar things? Would you? Are there other aspects of the position that you feel members generally haven't taken up that you want to?
Look, I think the people who run for council and win the seat have to do it in a way that's consistent with who they are and their training and experience. I didn't undertake this effort to be a potted plant. There are areas that I'm interested in, and I pursue them, and I don't expect to change that. There's some on the council who I know don't read the materials that are provided to us and on which we vote. And I know that because they ask questions, the answer to which are on the second page of the materials. I read the contracts and the supporting materials that we vote on. On the larger issues, I make an effort to speak with agency staff and affected individuals so I understand exactly the implications. As you probably guess, I'm comfortable with the legal side, but substantively, there are areas of contracting that the state does that I'm not familiar with. So I work hard to gain a factual understanding and try to also understand the policy. I think that's why people want me on the council, because I'm diligent and try to be competent and try to make informed decisions. And if I'm lucky enough to stay, I'll keep approaching it in that way.
On the pay scale issue, how do you use that information? And if you're calling out contractors to, up their pay, isn't there by extension, a higher cost to the state, ostensibly?
Okay, so 3 questions.
Yes, sure.
Which is okay. So I'm not so sure I would buy into the characterization that I'm calling anyone out. I'm making public information that we all should appreciate and understand the implications of it. So I ask the agencies when they have particularly labor-oriented contracts to ask the contractors what they pay their lowest paid workers. I said I would do that before I was elected, and I started doing it in January as soon as I was sworn in, and I recite the information in the council reports that I write generally after every meeting, and that goes pretty broadly to media outlets and individuals. So I do that. I think too often we as a state look only at cost and don't consider value. And so when you only choose the lowest bidder, and that lowest bidder takes that position because the company pays its employees a starvation wage, that has consequences. So when those employees finish their seasonal work, they go on unemployment and they have no resources to back them up. When they need food supplements and are on the SNAP program, that's us paying essentially to supplement that contractor. So it's a trade-off. I would rather have people who are working full-time be able to support themselves, and I don't think we should use the economic power of the state, which is substantial, even in our state, to support contractors that take advantage of their workforce. And I'm pretty open about that.
Doesn't that raise a slightly bigger question of what is a legislative function and what's an executive function?
In some ways it does. I don't vote against contracts because the contractors pay too little. I make sure everyone understands what those contractors pay, and then they're qualified by whatever agency is bringing it forward. New Hampshire doesn't have what's called a Little Bacon-Davis Act. Bacon-Davis is the federal law that requires the payment of prevailing wages. That whether to have that or not is a legislative function, and I'm deferential to that. Whether we should have a transparent government, the pieces that I touch, they're going to be transparent. And so I think that is my function, and that's one I pursue regularly.
Going back to one of the ways that people may recognize you as an executive counselor from the past 2 years, which was your involvement in an investigation with liquor sales. Getting past the specifics of what was happening that you were investigating in terms of breaking a threshold of the law, do you think that there's an inherent problem with the state relying on sales, liquor sales as a revenue source, in that it might encourage them to look the other way if a problem arises? in order to keep that revenue stream flowing?
If you're asking, do I think the state needs to get out of the liquor business? Not necessarily. Does the state have to do it legally? Absolutely. Do we now do the liquor business legally? Probably not. I think this is part of a series of symptoms that result from us not having a reliable revenue infrastructure, and that pushes us to cheat in certain ways. The Liquor Commission is responsible for about 6% of our state revenues, which is significant, and there's a great deal of pressure on the Liquor Commission and the commissioners, I guess it's a commissioner and a deputy commissioner, to produce, and they are failing at that. Their net revenues have been flat for half a dozen years maybe, and they're trying all sorts of schemes to increase their net revenues, one of which is this bootlegging illegal scheme. And although I appreciate and understand the pressures on them, we ought not to be in the business of money laundering, and I've been pretty clear about that.
Is there a particular mechanism you could see being put in place that would solve that?
I don't know if there's one, but we should clearly treat the liquor department as we do every other department of state government. They shouldn't have their own police force. We should remove the enforcement function from the Liquor Commission so that those officers can look up as well as looking down for illegality. We should require the Liquor Commission to submit to the same contracting approvals that all the other state agencies have to deal with. Most of the construction contracts that liquor puts out there to build new buildings are exempt from council review, and some might think that it's overbuilding, over-reliance on brick and mortar stores that are depressing the profitability of the Liquor Commission. And we should have, and this isn't just the Liquor Commission, we should have people who are competent at the business of the agency running the agency. And liquor doesn't have that. It's $1 billion retail business, and we don't have leadership there with anything close to the experience that's necessary to run a company of that size. And so I think we need to have the legislature look at requiring professional management of a business that's that important to the state.
Before we get too far ahead on other topics, I wanted to backtrack to this notion you brought up about the fact that some executive councils aren't doing their due diligence and reading the full documentation, which is foundational to everything you do. What, to your view, is the detriment to the state when that's happening?
Oh, there are quite a number of detriments to the state, but I think what happens often is that if it's a contract put forward by the governor of your party, then you support the contract, whether you read it or not, and there's not a lot of effort required to do that. We've had instances where the governor put forward a form of contract, a loan guarantee, that would have gone to a company that had recently been convicted of hazardous waste felonies. And no one at the table knew that. I figured it out the day before the hearing on the loan guarantee and raised it with everyone. I went to the governor at the breakfast meeting before it was public and said, "Do you know who this is? They owe us $500,000 in fines," actually fines that were imposed here in Cheshire County. And the governor had no clue. He said, "Go talk to my lawyer right away." And I spoke with John Formello about it. He did some quick checking, and turned out I was right, and the guarantee was voted down. But there is a need for us all, governor and council, to be better prepared. And I recognize it's a heavy lift. The councilors don't have staff. The governor's chosen to surround himself with staff that don't pay a lot of attention to detail. So they don't compensate for the governor's shortcomings in that regard. And things come up that are concerning.
In the 2 years you've been there, you've had a Republican governor, and the majority of the council has been Republican. So there've been a number of instances where you've found yourself on the short end of a 3-2 vote along party lines.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that one of the prime directives for the council is to act as a check on the governor, does that work? Is it entirely a function of which party controls the council and which party is in the governor's office, or do you think that by and large the council is able to be that check regardless of party affiliation?
I think the answer is partly in the voting and partly in enhanced transparency. So I've lost some votes 2-3, lost some votes 1-4, quite frankly, where I disclosed something that I thought was problematic about the item on the agenda. And that disclosure becomes part of the public discussion. So maybe I lose the vote, but people tend to understand what the issue is better. And so that kind of enhanced transparency, I think, is one way of doing that reality checking of the governor. There have been a number of votes where I was able to bring along a third person from the other party. I'm not particularly partisan, so my approach to the agenda items doesn't reflect a partisan bent. And there are a number of occasions where just understanding the issues a little better, because either I've done my homework or because it relates to something that I have experience with, allows me to make headway with some of my colleagues. So in the 10-year transportation planning process, there were 3-2 votes in my favor on commuter rail and on a modest toll increase. And that was Chris Pappas, Russ Prescott, and me. There have been business issues that come up before the council, where once I convinced Councilor Prescott that I could read a balance sheet, he's willing to listen to me on those issues.
I want to talk about the recent pardon hearing vote. Last week, you voted to grant the hearing. That was one of those 2-3 votes, I believe. Did that have to do with the specifics of that case in particular, or did it reflect sort of a broader notion that, you know, these pardons should be heard more, that we need to be doing that more?
I think it's a combination of the two. The place pardon hearing must be the 5th or 6th pardon hearing that I voted on, and I voted against granting a hearing on the others because either they weren't legally appropriate or there was nothing to justify taking a second look at what happened. So I think it'd be wrong to say that I think there should always be a pardon hearing. But in the circumstance of the place hearing, I think there were equities to be balanced, and I thought there would be a lot to be gained by holding a public hearing. And I was outvoted.
And sort of following up on that, in a broader sense, one of the issues there was the PTSD this man was allegedly suffering from, and we see a lot of crimes in general where there are mental health issues involved, whether it's PTSD or something else, but also very concerning conduct, robberies, whatever, threats. Do we need to sort of think somewhat differently or reevaluate how we think about culpability in these cases?
Framing it in terms of culpability may be too great a change in approach, but being able to include consideration of mental health issues and not having mandatory terms, which is what happened to Place. Place was convicted in a horrible murder of Wanda Olson. None of this diminishes what happened to her. But requiring Place to serve life in prison when the prosecutors in the case, prosecutors and police, offered him a plea to a second-degree murder for 18 years. He's now served 35 years, so just about double what they were willing to allow him to plead guilty to. That's, to me, a fairness issue. The people on the scene assessing the case in the context of the criminal justice system and the state's prosecution assessed it at one level. If indeed Mr. Place was suffering from PTSD, which I think was the case, and it wasn't treated before he committed the murder, and it certainly wasn't treated while he was waiting in jail for his trial. A person suffering with PTSD, locked up without treatment, was forced to make a decision to plead guilty or go to trial, and we shouldn't take a second look at whether that decision was in error. That strikes me as being inappropriately harsh and rigid, and I thought that there was an opportunity for both the domestic violence community to come forward and state their case, and for particularly the Vietnam veterans community. I think this was an affront to them, given what this man suffered through in Vietnam. And I met with Place, and I intentionally brought Joe Kenny with me. My colleague Joe Kenny is a retired Marine colonel, and I wanted Kenny to hear Place's description of his battlefield stress so that I could ask Joe about it afterwards and see if it rang true. Kenny's a little younger than Place, so he wasn't in Vietnam. But Kenny said the descriptions were accurate. This fellow was in the 100-day siege at Khe Sanh, where the purpose of the bombing was to demoralize and scare and stress the soldiers that were on the plateau. And not only was Place subjected to that, he had some duties that put him really close to the carnage. And then he came back from Vietnam and everyone looked the other way when he needed help. So that doesn't diminish what he did to Wanda Olson, but you have to wonder if some of the fault lies with society, and that resulted in some ways or contributed in some ways to this murder. And I thought that should have been aired. A flack for it.
What do you think is working about the state's 10-year transportation plan, and what do you think might need to be changed?
So I knew a little bit about infrastructure before getting elected, but boy, I feel like I got tossed into the deep end trying to absorb everything that was being thrown at us. as public servants trying to hold these public hearings on roads, bridges, commuter rail, aeronautics. So it was a steep learning curve. We collectively, I think we held 23 hearings around the state. The hearings that I chaired, and I wound up chairing a couple of extras, were really packed full of information by people with different perspectives and different interests. I thought it was a marvelous process, I have to say. And the fact that the Transportation Commissioner the current Transportation Commissioner has imposed what's called a conformed budget, which means things don't go in the 10-year plan unless there's a reasonable possibility that they'll get funded when their term comes up. It used to be the 10-year transportation plan was a political wish list, and you could put in it whatever you want and tell your constituents that you're protecting them, even though you knew the money would never be there. So the 10-year transportation plan under Victoria Sheehan has become more limited because she wanted to be realistic, and it helps us inform the public of the limitations of our state government. So there are safety issues, there are design issues. In Concord, where I live, there's a clogged highway every Friday afternoon and every Sunday afternoon, and we're not going to address it for another 6 or 8 years because there isn't the money to do that, even though it stifles commerce. So there's a lot about the process that I actually liked. It's really time consuming, but it does allow people to see how this part of government works. There is one part that could have been a problem. My colleague David Wheeler doesn't like commuter rail, and I had realized about a month into the process that he had intentionally not scheduled a hearing for Nashua, the state's second largest city. And so I went to our next meeting, breakfast meeting, and said to Councilor Wheeler that if he didn't have the time to hold the hearing in Nashua, I would be happy to chair it for him. And that led to a little bit of bullying, I gotta say, by the governor and by Wheeler. The governor said it's been 100 years that it's the councilor's prerogative of where to hold hearings in his district, and you should stand down. So I hear that from the governor. Meanwhile, I know we've only had this process since 1980, so it's not 100 years. And before going to the hearing, I checked the statute, and any counselor can hold a hearing anywhere he or she wants. And so I told the governor that, and I said, if you don't have a hearing scheduled by next Tuesday, so we meet on Wednesdays, you have until next Tuesday to schedule a hearing in Nashua, Councilor Wheeler, or I'm going to schedule one. And so Tuesday afternoon, David Wheeler capitulated and scheduled a hearing at Nashua Community College, and it actually turned out to be a good hearing. I think there were 150 people who testified, and surprise, surprise, many of them testified in favor of commuter rail, something that David didn't want in the record, and I suspect nor did the governor.
Speaking of getting around, last week you were here in Keene, kind of in another role,
Yeah.
running a forum on public education funding. How does that type of I don't know if it's educational or activist or what, but that type of role, how does that mesh with the role of being on the executive council? Does it stem from that, or is that just something you do because of your specific background?
I think both. I've had a long and abiding interest in public education and how it's funded, and so I certainly wasn't going to sacrifice that when I became a counselor. But by the same token, being a counselor gives me a bully pulpit to speak from. And I think people would agree that I'm the highest elected state office holder that's a true progressive. And so I think it's my responsibility to speak to important issues, and I think education funding is one of the most important issues our state faces. And it's also related to my supervision in a rough way of the Department of Education, because I have to confirm the education commissioner, who at one point talked about having a commission to study school funding, and that was over a year ago, and it has never met to my knowledge. So someone has to do it.
And in your background, before you were on the council and you were actively litigating, you represented, for people who don't know, some of the poorest towns in the state in suing the state government over education funding. And not long before you ran for council, you represented one of the wealthier towns in the state.
Actually, Dover isn't one of the wealthier.
Then is it?
They're
No?
middle wealth,
Okay.
middle value.
What, given the expertise that you have in this, the experience, what are your thoughts in how to equitably fund education for all of the communities in the state?
Somehow I thought you'd ask that. I think you have to have a broad, common, detailed understanding of how the current system works and how it disadvantages the majority of students and taxpayers in the state before you can start designing a replacement system. Because if you go to the replacement system too quickly, then the whole fight is this proposal good or bad? And there's no context to consider it. Is it better or worse than what we have should be the question. And in order to have that discussion, people have to understand what we have. So 77% of the children in New Hampshire live in communities with below average property values. If you have a system that is so heavily reliant on local property taxes, that should make a difference. And we need to have a broad understanding of that. If you have a statewide system and one community, Winchester, has, I think it's $390,000 against which it can levy a tax for each kid in its school system, $390,000, and Portsmouth has 2.6 million, and Moultonborough has 6.2 million. That's not a system. That's a confederation, and children who live in Winchester suffer as a result. And so I think we need to have a broad understanding of that before we talk about remedies. And that's what my friend John Tobin and I are trying to accomplish.
So where does all this go? You've had hearings, some hearings or open forums, whatever you want to call them, around the state. Are there more scheduled, and when you wrap those up, what happens next?
So there are 4 more scheduled. We're in North Haverhill tomorrow night. Thursday night is Lebanon, or Mascoma, sorry, Mascoma. Then October 2nd is Concord, and October 10th is Rochester. In each of the forums, we ask those who attend to ask the candidates for public office where they stand. And so our hope is that we'll inform the electorate on things like the reduction in stabilization monies, which hurts a ton of communities. That's why this issue's bubbling up, because the state is actually withdrawing its support for public education rather than moving it forward. And so the first thing is to get representatives and senators that actually represent the people that send them to Concord. So that's step one. Step two is the hope that those folks will, who are elected, will craft legislation that stops the decrease in stabilization, that returns some of the money that has been lost over the last 3 fiscal years, and then that tackles the big issue of how do we design a fair system of public ed funding. And so that's where we're heading, and we're pretty direct about it.
What is your sense of the resonancy that this issue is having with taxpayers, never mind the elected officials? It seems to have regained a little bit, but is it happening on that level too? This is a group of people who were mad as hell for a long time, and then it sort of went off the radar.
And they've forgotten about it. They think it's fixed.
Yeah.
Except when you're involved with schools.
Right.
So this all started from an offhand conversation with Pittsfield School District because they were so desperate and found themselves laying off kindergarten and elementary teachers because of budget cuts that they wanted to know how to reform a school funding lawsuit, and asked me about it, and I said I can't do it, but I'm happy to help you explain to your local constituents why your budget keeps going down each year and why you have to keep raising taxes just to stand still. And that first forum had 110 people show up in Little Pittsfield, and word got out. We got invited to Newport, where there were 120. Berlin had 150, 160 people. Berlin has the lowest property value in the state, and the system is not sustainable for them. They're really worried about what comes next. They lose $220,000 in state funding each and every year. Costs them 56 cents on their tax rate to make up for that. That's not sustainable, and it's not appropriate.
Are there states you look at out there who you think are doing a pretty good job of funding and could serve as models?
Yeah, there are a few. You have to bring it back to what would fly in New Hampshire. But Vermont and Massachusetts both had school funding cases at the same time as ours. And Vermont pretty much solved theirs within a year or two. Massachusetts did the same and had one subsequent challenge that didn't go anywhere. So there are funding models. Kentucky, very poor state, had a challenge in the late 80s and seemed to respond well to it. There are 35 states that have had this litigation, so there are lots of examples for us to learn from. Putting our heads in the sand is probably not the approach that should be taken, which is what we tend to do till we get sued again.
Are there issues you've had to deal with that are specific to the second district, or in which maybe the district's interests don't align with those of other parts of the state, and how do you reconcile that?
You know, there haven't been a lot that are peculiar to the second district. Of course, you know, when you deal with infrastructure issues, there's a limited pot of money, and whether it goes to one district or the other, comes to the western part of my district or goes to the eastern part of my district, those are balancing acts. One of the things that Russ Prescott, Chris Pappas, and I worked on was getting more money into infrastructure development off of the turnpike system. And part of the modest toll increase was designed to do that, so that you could get money into the sideways byways and get out of the corridor north to south. And that died when the governor said he would veto anything we did on, or negate anything we did on tolls. And that caused us to lose Russ Prescott's vote. But that threat in particular kept money out of Keene. And it was unfortunate. Of course, the governor also undermined the effort to access $4 million in federal planning money for commuter rail. So he had promised commuter rail to Amazon to lure them to New Hampshire. So he was stuck voting for that, or keeping that in his revision to the 10-year transportation plan. But then it shortly came out that he told his allies in the legislature to cut it for him. And some of them spoke publicly about that. And so commuter rail was threatened in the legislature.
Do you think the current thresholds for the contracts that the council reviews are the right ones, too high, too low?
We could probably do our work better with higher thresholds, so that we could focus more on the more important issues.
You think if it was higher, then some of the other councils would have more time to read their packets?
That was a rhetorical question.
Yes, it was.
You're good.
I'll tell you one funny thing about that is it's not an age thing or party thing, but Chris Pappas and I get our agendas and all the related materials on our iPads. So when we come to a meeting, we carry an iPad in. The other three still get their contracts and related materials printed out and delivered to them by the state police. And so every Friday they get a packet with all those materials in it. And as we get closer to the end of the fiscal year, our packets get bigger and bigger. So there may be 300 items in June on our agenda. And when Joe Kenny puts his materials on the table, the governor and I can't see each other. and the governor knows that I'm the one most likely to ask questions about some of his things. And so he spends his meeting kind of looking around for me, trying to make sure I'm staying out of trouble.
I think maybe he'd be happier not being able to see.
If
So
only
you're
they
saying
could
that
build the wall.
those counselors care about our timber industry, and you don't.
I hope that's another rhetorical question.
How do you approach judicial appointments and other positions you need to approve?
Competence first. Experience in the relevant subject area. Support of the mission of the agency or the judiciary, as the case may be. Partisanship, almost never. I have good friends who are conservative Republicans, but who are good lawyers, and who I trust to do a fair job if they were judges. And so I'm most interested in that. Department heads, the governor put forward 2 people who are completely unacceptable. One is now a commissioner and the other was withdrawn. And I think both of those efforts were a disservice to the state.
Is there anything relevant or useful about yourself or your candidacy that voters would be good to know before you go to the polls in November that we haven't talked about today?
You know, I don't often talk about it, but I have 3 children, of which I'm very, very proud. Our oldest is a middle school science teacher. Our middle child, our daughter, is a social worker in a high school in a very challenging part of New York City. And our youngest used to be my secret weapon. She was an art major interested in graphics who co-owned a unionized printing shop in Brooklyn. And so she did all of my art and printing work. And then she went and took some accounting courses in night school and won a fellowship to get an MBA. So I've lost my printer. But all 3 of my children will have, by May, professional degrees, master's level professional degrees. Education is really important in our family. I am a first-generation college student. I'm actually the only one of there are 4 siblings. I'm the only one to go to college. My wife is also a first-generation college student. Her brother went to college and graduated, but she and her brother were the first to take advantage of college. We take this pretty seriously. We live on 5 acres in rural Concord, in a home that we've lived in for 29 years. We don't spend extravagantly, except on education. So I'm proud that we were able to help our kids through college, and they've all done well as a result. So that's probably something that doesn't show up on the palm card too often.
Well, we appreciate you coming over this way to visit us.
Well, you know, it's part of my responsibility, and so I drive this way a lot. And I drive to Rochester a lot. I feel a little bad for the people who live on one end of the district or the other. It gives me a tiny bit of advantage living in the middle. But it's a terribly gerrymandered district, and we ought to fix that in the next legislative session by putting an independent committee in place, independent commission in place, so that we can deal with the 2020 census when it's done. But thank you for your time.